All right. So, how is everyone today? Right on. Excellent. So, I hope the meter levels seem to be working, and hopefully this microphone will improve the sound quality on, I hope it's not going to be too loud or something, but hopefully this microphone will improve the sound quality on my YouTube videos. So, where were we? I really got into the subject, not more than I did before, of this. I learned a new word, endling. We just saw an endling. We just saw Ben. They give them names. They all have names, of course. The endlings. There's a very cute kind of toad, I think, or some kind of a frog. Many species of frogs around the world are just collapsing and going extinct. In fact, they've been harvesting them. I'm not harvesting them. They've been catching the few that are left. But anyway, an endling is an individual that is the last of its species or subspecies. Of course, there's the most famous endling, probably Benjamin. Funny thing about Benjamin is people have looked at him, on the video, on the movie, believe he's he's not a he, he's a she, a female. But evidently the males had pouches also, and I guess sometimes if you didn't know what you were doing, you wouldn't be able to tell the gender. But the males had pouches just to tuck their genitalia, their testicles mainly. As they go through brush, they had a little protective pouch for their testicles. And then the females, of course, had a pouch because they're marsupials, and that's where their babies start their life, continue their early lives, their childhoods. But anyway, and I guess Benjamin was mistreated. Those of you who were paying attention, there was a little note on there about how evidently they left the cage door locked, and it was really cold. It was unusually cold, and she couldn't stand the cold and died. It's a shocking level of disrespect I've noticed to a lot of these endlings. Now, not so much, but almost as though cultural guilt, makes us want to just treat these last ones of their kind with contempt, like what was done to Martha. You might say they gave her a nice home and everything, but they charged people to go visit her. They lined up, and anyway, it strikes me as something perhaps not quite appropriate about all that. Anyway, some famous endlings. It's a fairly new word. It's only come up in the last 20 years or so. Notable examples: the great auks were killed. Last one died 1852. These were migratory, very large migratory seabirds, like pelicans. Anyway, the quagga. I'm not sure what the quagga were. I think they were a South American. Equus. They're in the equus with same genus as the horse, but they're very small South American ungulate. Anyway, the passenger pigeon, of course, Martha, very famous. Evidently, her mate, they named her mate George, and initially they didn't give her a name, but Martha was the wife of George Washington, so they wanted to. So anyway, even the endling, was disrespected in her by only obtaining her name in virtue, through her mate. But her mate died in 1911, and then she hung on for about another 2.5, 3 years, and then she died 1914. The last, and then interestingly enough, the last Carolina parakeet died in the same zoo 4 years later. I believe the same cage, actually. So a couple of endlings shared the same fate in the same zoo. Booming Ben, solitary heath hen, last seen on Martha's Vineyard. There's a video you can see on YouTube of those guys. I think the last couple, they do these amazing dances. The booming bens make this loud voice, and they ram into each other's chests. Another very large prairie-type bird, I believe. And then the owo, you can see them too. The Hawaiian. Anyway, I'm not sure if they mentioned the the last ivory-billed. I'm not sure if they knew who the last ivory-billed woodpecker was, but these were magnificent birds, very large, much bigger even than the pileated woodpecker, and its beautiful white bill, which is where it got its name. And they also went extinct in the early part of the 20th century. But this cute guy, Tuffy, I think there's Tuffy right there. See him? He's an endling, Tuffy. And he doesn't like to be held. Evidently, he'll pinch your finger when you, like, shortly after this photo was taken, I'm sure he squeezed down and said, "Put me down, I don't want to be held." Anyway, cute little guy. These guys are all going extinct because of, his family and many other families of frogs and toads are going extinct because of all kinds of chemicals, I think. Anyway, so very interesting. And this week, today is our day to talk about animal rights, okay? And again, it's another fairly accessible topic, so I would encourage people to jump in. I took note of I have some lecture slides to go through today, but I also want to try to focus in on a couple, they're really just thought experiments. We're going to venture off again into the realm of thought experiments as we consider the moral status of different kinds of beings, all right? But I thought of, okay, this lifeboat example that Regan uses. And there's still a puzzle in my mind about exactly what Tom Regan is arguing and how stringent his animal rights ethic really is. On one hand, he seems to be arguing that where vital human needs are at stake, then instrumentalization of an animal is okay, of a non-human animal is okay. And that's one certainly very plausible reading of what he's saying. And that rules out a lot of uses of animals. It rules out eating meat, it rules out most laboratory testing, although it allows for some exceptions, perhaps, of some laboratory testing if a vital human need is demonstrably and verifiably at stake, and the experiment or the testing, whatever you're doing, is very likely to lead to something that's going to actually heal a human being. Then perhaps, but on a more stringent reading, all right, two conditions have to be present in order for the instrumentalization of an animal to be possible. The first, I've already mentioned, that still has to be the case that a vital human need is at stake, all right? But even more stringently, the second condition that needs to be present is that the only alternative to instrumentalizing the non-human animal is to instrumentalize a human animal. And so the mere fact alone, for example, that you have a deteriorating heart and you're going to die does not justify you, under this more stringent reading of what Regan is arguing, does not justify you. Let's say chimpanzee, I'll use this example perhaps a few times during today's lecture. Let's say, another thought experiment, okay? Let's say medical science and technology has advanced to such a point where we know that if we harvested the heart of a chimpanzee, then we can use that heart to save the life of a human being and give that human being, a meaningful, let's say at least 15 or 20 more years of meaningful life, okay? Healthy functioning, etc., family relationships healthy, all that stuff, okay? That's one example I want to use, all right? And it seems as though the more stringent reading of what Tom Regan is arguing is that, no, the sick, the ill, the human with a congenital heart disease, his heart's deteriorating very rapidly, and if he only gets this transplant, no, because that involves fully instrumentalizing the chimpanzee. And if we were in like a lifeboat situation where we had to throw out either the chimpanzee or the human, then we would have to choose. We'd have to instrumentalize one or the other, right? But here, by not harvesting the heart of the chimpanzee, we're not instrumentalizing the human. The human is dying of something unrelated to whatever we do to the chimpanzee, right? Okay, you guys get that? So perhaps Regan's making this very strong argument that where instrumentalization is just the bottom line. First, you check and see if the animal is the subject of a life. Does the animal have enough self-awareness to view himself in some sense as an actor, with a set of desires and goals, etc.? Or is the animal a subject of life? If it is, then according to this more stringent Regan argument, you can't instrumentalize it, period. even if instrumentalizing it is going to save your life, okay? The only conditions in which you can instrumentalize that dog is when the only choice is to instrumentalize yourself or another human being. The only other alternative is, like in the lifeboat example, right? Just to review real quick, in the lifeboat example, there are, let's say, four 130-pound humans and one 130-pound dog, okay? And the lifeboat can only hold 4 for any reasonable length of time, right? 4 130-pound animals. So you have one too many, right? And let's say initially we'll just assume that all the humans are healthy adults with no disabilities, no mental infirmities, etc. No terminal illnesses. They're all healthy, relatively young adults with a lot of life left ahead of them. And the dog is also relatively healthy. In this example, if you don't instrumentalize the dog, then you're going to have to instrumentalize one of the human beings. You see the difference? Okay? But that very rarely happens in real life. And so if Regan's more stringent reading is correct, if the more stringent reading of Regan is correct, then he's offering us a really sturdy defense of the rights, the ends in themselves status of any being that is aware enough of itself. And then you might ask, well, what qualifies? I think getting down to nuts and bolts, getting down to actual animals, I think Regan's talking about pretty much all mammals, all individual mammals and all individual birds, okay? There's a great variety of intelligence among birds. It's not clear that some birds might not actually be subjects of a life, Anyway, all right, but let's consider some other types of beings that might be on the lifeboat. And just as a mental exercise, right? And this is not necessarily pertinent to environmental ethics. It might be. There might be some situations where the land manager has to adopt an individualistic, more than anthropocentric perspective and start considering the moral status of different kinds of beings, right? But in general, a land, water, air, wildlife manager is worried about ecological holes. And you see ecological holes are nowhere on here because we're not holists today. Today we're just, and you might ask, well, why are we studying animal rights now, okay? And it seems to be a discontinuity of sorts in the curricula. Because all of a sudden we're taking this, and it might seem like too much of an interlude, right? This is a class in environmental ethics. All of a sudden we're spending one day on animal rights. And I do want to talk about animal rights mostly today. But also keep in mind that we're trying to reconstruct a more difficult, more exotic type of normative argument, which is the deontological argument, okay? Which is the Kantian argument, okay? And the reason we're studying specifically Tom Regan today is because he is a deontological defender, champion of the notion that many non-human animals have moral status, okay? And he uses this deontological argument in rough form to reach the conclusions that he aims to reach, right? So that's why we're studying Regan specifically, but we'll also have to brush over, go over mainly today, I think, the only other normative theory about animal rights that we might consider is the utilitarian view, because Regan considers it maybe at greater length than any of the other types of views, and also because modern moral philosophy is largely a confrontation between the Kantians and the utilitarians. So if we're just going to choose two of these norms, and there's also, of course, a virtue ethics tradition of animal welfare ethics, and there's even probably a natural law theory tradition of animal welfare ethics. I suggest that perhaps the original St. Francis would be a good example of an NLT, animal welfare ethicist, right? And he might even just be a flat-out biocentrist. I don't know enough about his life. I know that he talked to beings and considered them as having personalities, like worms, that we would never, not to mention birds and all the other animals that he interacted with and talked to, right? He treated them all as persons, right? As personalities, as yous. Perhaps you could even use the word as thous, right? The worm was a thou to St. Francis. And so perhaps the tree even was a thou. The bee, right? The bee was a thou. The bee was gathering nectar to make honey, right? The bee is a thou. For St. Francis. And so, and then you might wonder, well, how many other beings are thous? How many other beings have interiorities, right? And if he's coming from a very religious perspective like St. Francis, he's probably going to have to say, well, these other beings were created by God too, and they're thous, right, also. In any event, that's a good example probably. St. Francis might be a good example. Like John Muir is a good example of an NLT, holistic more than anthro, right? St. Francis is a good example of an individualistic more than anthro. From an NLT, right? From a natural law theory perspective. All right, anyway, I don't know how, I just we're throwing, I write little notes to myself on my iPhone and then I email them to myself. And that way I'm not chained down to a desk anywhere and I can just keep on working. So I threw these out. Pregnant thylacine, wouldn't that be interesting? There's a real thought experiment, right? She's an ender. Imagine if Ben, the one they named Ben, will happen to be pregnant, right? And she ended up on the lifeboat. Does the disabled human get pushed off? Who's in charge here? Ivaldo's in charge? He's got the pregnant thylacine on the lifeboat? The species? We're going to read Rolston. The reason we're considering enders today and species that are teetering on the brink of extinction or that have already gone extinct is because Rolston is all about the intrinsic values of species. That's all I asked you to read, right? The lecture I have prepared is an older lecture that actually goes over Rolston's treatment of intrinsic value at other levels, at ecosystem levels and at the Earth as a whole level. But right, I think that it's shorter than the other essay that I've asked previous classes to read, and it focuses more just on, what are the non-consequentialist values. How could we characterize non-consequentialist values in species? How can we make sense of that, right? Not the old Wilsonian defense of biodiversity because it's ultimately the most selfish and totally self-interested and humans have to do it because we're losing our minds, right? No. Rolston might agree with Wilson at some level, about all that, that certainly the anthropocentric reasons are very, very strong, but Rolston wants to say there are these other reasons that are even stronger, that are more important, more comprehensive, that are more truthful because they're more comprehensive. They account for the full range of value in a species as opposed to just what a human might value in the species. All right? So let's see what else I sent myself. I forget. Oh yeah. I got my little animal welfare. What is that? Oh yeah, there's the ivory-billed woodpecker. I could have played the end on that one too. These animals, these enders, these endlings. Each of us could be an endling. It's a movie somebody made in 1962, I think, called On the Beach with Gregory Peck. In those days, popular consciousness just was filled with dread of a nuclear apocalypse. And this movie depicts this happening, right? And Gregory Peck is the captain of a submarine. And they're the last humans, right? And they're just kind of roaming the open sea, and everywhere they go, there are no humans. Everyone's dead. Anyway, and then eventually there was just one or two of them left. But that's what these guys are going, and they don't have the consciousness, you could say, to realize it. But it's their Holocaust, it's their apocalypse. Anyway, so animal welfare ethics, these are the different kinds of issues that an animal welfare activist and an animal welfare ethicist are very concerned about. And we could list others, of course, but the main ones are meat production and consumption, and there we have to draw a distinction between factory farming, where there's pain and suffering throughout the lives of the animals, and then what you might call more humane farming and ranching, where there's pain and suffering, but only at the end, right? And that would probably exclude things like veal production and foie gras and the disgusting things like that. But it would still allow, if you give the pig, a good 2-3 years of life, and he's happy and he gets to root around in the dirt like they want to do, and he has enough room to run around and he has friends to socialize with, and then you kill him right at the very end, right? And you eat his meat in a healthy way and you don't feed him chemicals and junk like that, corn, right? Anyway, so you have to make a distinction, right, between different kinds of meat production, different kinds of meat consumption. And then, of course, you've got your non-meat animal stuff, eggs and dairy primarily. And, of course, you can also distinguish between factory farm versus humane farmed eggs, humane farmed dairy, etc. And then lab testing, of course, is another big issue that Regan mentioned specifically. And I mentioned a distinction between, well, perhaps some lab testing is done for vital human needs if they can be identified, right? And some, but most like cosmetics, right? I mean, the level of willful ignorance that I don't want to pick on one gender, but men use cosmetics too. The tests that they perform on many of these animals are done just to test whether or not this lipstick is going to produce a rash, And And so what do? They shave the whole animal and they smear this lipstick all over the poor animal, over his genitals and his butt and everything. And then, and that's pointless. I mean, you could say that's pointless, right? A lot more than you could say, well, if they're doing it to cure leukemia, and there's a serious research, progress being made on this one research, and, then, all right. And then hunting, of course. Sport is very different, of course. Sport hunting is the main target. The last of the three kinds is sometimes referred to as therapeutic hunting, which sounds a bit odd because it sounds like, well, there's, some guy needs therapy and so he's going to get his gun and go shoot some animals to get his therapy. That's not what that means. So I like to call it ecosystem. The idea that Leopold championed, in the absence of natural predators, sometimes you need to go in there and manage the ecosystem by culling a deer herd, for example, okay? But obviously the hunting that's most condemned is, of course, hunting that's done just for sport, that has no real subsistence necessity. And then, of course, entertainment, circuses, zoos, marine amusement parks, and then exotic animals. And then, of course, when we start talking about habitat destruction, we're starting to talk a lot more about, concerns that an environmentalist or an ecocentrist are going to be most interested in. And when we talk about endangered species, it would be interesting to ask each of these animal rights philosophers, animal welfare ethicists, whether they would view an individual member of an endangered species as having greater moral status than an individual member. Does an individual thylacine, let's say they found a couple thylacines hidden away out in the middle of nowhere in Tasmania, would those individual thylacines have more moral status than Roy the dog? Okay? And the answer, by the way, Tom Regan has to give, because he's committed to his theory, is no. They don't have. The individual thylacines that were recently rediscovered are not anymore, have no more moral status than Roy the dog. Okay? But that doesn't mean that humans might not find very good reasons to, if they're forced to choose between the thylacine individual and the dog individual, to choose, but not for rights-based reasons. Only for only for anthropocentric reasons, right? Because humans like endangered animals. They want to save them, bring them back. So of course we're going to treat the thylacine much better if we have to, right? If we have to throw one of them overboard off the lifeboat, we're going to throw the dog overboard, right? But that's only for human considerations, not for animal rights considerations. All right. So what kind of animals? By the way, there are some really interesting stories out there from a long time ago. But British common law, as I've mentioned before, has been around for almost a couple thousand years now. And it's had a long time to evolve. And I guess in the 17th and 18th centuries, there were some instances where humans were shipwrecked and starving. And I haven't read up on this stuff very recently, so I don't remember it exactly. But some crew members of a they were shipwrecked. There was no food, right? And so they euthanized, they killed one of their crewmates and cannibalized, drank his blood to provide themselves with some liquid, and I don't know if that helps actually, but anyway, and then ate his body, right? And they managed to, and then eventually they were rescued, right? And they were brought back to civilization, and they were quite candid, everyone asked them, well, how'd you do this? And they had to admit, what they did. And lo and behold, they were put on trial. Interesting, isn't it? They were put on trial, they were charged with murder, and they were convicted. Now, don't quote me on all this. If you're interested, just go look it up. There are these famous stories and perhaps that's only right, that they would be convicted. I suspect their punishment was nominal, but as a matter of law, they were guilty of murder. And the circumstances that they faced, the hypothetical, all the stuff they had to overcome just to survive, don't excuse the killing of their fellow crew member. So, in a lifeboat situation, if there were 5 humans, right, I think there is one view that says you can't throw any of them overboard. You just can't. And if you do, then you're charged with murder, right? And murder is never justified by consequences, ever, right? Anyway, and it might be interesting to consider a chimp. You remember this condition, this characteristic that humans have, exclusively seem to have, until we know more, till we can communicate. Except, we can communicate with chimpanzees. Can't we ask them, can't we do some research and figure out whether or not they're capable of making and keeping promises? Because they can do sign language, right? So, if it turns out that they can, then does that mean the chimpanzee who knows sign language has greater moral status than the chimpanzee who does not know sign language? If Regan's on the lifeboat, one other human and three chimpanzees, and one of them knows sign language, the other two don't, does that mean you choose one of them that doesn't? Interesting, right? All right, and then there are all these other creatures that we might put on the lifeboat, or we might think about the moral status of. So where are we now? All right. This Norfolk bubik is an interesting example of an animal that was about to go extinct and did go extinct. There's an endling here too. I forget what her name is, but I don't know if they gave her a name. But what they did was they brought in another subspecies, right? When they knew there was only one female left, they brought in other subspecies. This is Norfolk Island, a very fascinating place. Did you guys ever get one of those Norfolk Island pines for Christmas? They kind of look like Christmas trees, right? You get them anyway. That's where they come from. And they're in the same family as those monkey puzzle trees. Those are called Araucaria or Araucania. I forget how you say that. Anyway, that's what they call them down there. They grow really well around here because it's the same kind of climate. And so does Norfolk Island. These are places in the South Atlantic. And it's cold, it's cool. They have a very cool temperate climate over there. But anyway, they evolved this owl, and the last one was in 1996, sighted for the last time in 1996. But meanwhile, they introduced two males. Isn't that interesting? From New Zealand, from a different subspecies, right? But they could interbreed. Anyway, and then sure enough, after a couple weeks, they found one of the males dead. And then the other male bred with the female. So the strongest male ended up, being victorious, and he just said, all right, man, you're dead, you're gone. And then he got to mate with the female, and now they've survived. So they still have some genetic material from that unusual subspecies. Anyway, all kinds of fascinating stories out there about animals that went extinct. All right, and there's our old friend. Oh, okay, and the passenger pigeon. We talked about that a little bit on, let's see, I want to find this. Our Uncle Aldo was invited to give a dedication speech at a monument. At a monument in, where are we? I want to go to the bird watching. There it is. In Wisconsin. There's Uncle Aldo. He was a very, very knowledgeable ornithologist. He boasted in letters back home. He wrote letters all the time, to his parents when he was they sent him away, I think, when he was about 16 or 17 to a private school in the East, and he would write a lot of letters home. And he boasted, when he was only like 16 or 17, he boasted in one of his letters that he could now identify over 100 species of birds. And of course, this was something he kept doing his whole life. So by the time he's this age, he knows everything there is to know practically. So they asked him to speak at this dedication of this monument to the passenger pigeon. And here it is. Here's a depiction of it here. It's at the confluence of the Mississippi and some other confluence of the Wisconsin and the Mississippi rivers in southwestern Wisconsin, Wyalusing State Park. And that's what it looks like. And I guess that's sort of a cliff, that goes down. There's a bluff that goes down to where the river is. And then this is what it, well, I have it on my slides. I have all this for you. I transposed this. That's what the caption, or whatever you call that. Dedicated to the last Wisconsin passenger pigeon, shot at Babcock, Wisconsin, September 1899. This species became extinct through the avarice and thoughtlessness of man. Isn't that interesting? All right, and then let's just go ahead and read through it. Read a little Aldo, every couple of weeks or so, just to keep us inspired. This also appears in a Sand County Almanac. So in 1947, the Wisconsin Society for Ornithology erected a monument to the passenger pigeon. The following essay, penned by Aldo Leopold on the occasion of the dedication of the monument, is widely regarded as the most poignant ever written about extinction. We meet here to commemorate the death of a species. This monument symbolizes our sorrow. We grieve because no living man will see again the onrushing phalanx of victorious birds sweeping a path for spring across the March skies, chasing the defeated winter from all the woods and prairies of Wisconsin. Men still live who in their youth remember pigeons. Trees still live that in their youth were shaken by a living wind. But a few decades hence, only the oldest oaks will remember, and at long last, only the hills will know. Okay. There will always be pigeons in books and in museums, but these are effigies and images, dead to all hardships and to all delights. Book pigeons cannot dive out of a cloud to make the deer run for cover, nor clap their wings in thunderous applause of mast-laden woods. They know no urge of seasons, they feel no kiss of sun, no lash of wind and weather. They live forever by not living at all. Our grandfathers who saw the glory of the fluttering hosts were less well-housed, well-fed, well-clothed than we are. The strivings by which they bettered our lot are also those which deprived us of pigeons. Perhaps we now grieve because we are not sure in our hearts that we have gained by the exchange. It is a century now since Darwin gave us the first glimpse of the origin of species. We know now what was unknown to all the preceding caravan of generations, that man is only a fellow voyager with other creatures in the odyssey of evolution, and that his captaincy of the adventuring ship conveys the power, but not necessarily the right, to discard at will among the crew. We should, in the century since Darwin, have achieved a sense of community with living things, and of wonder over the magnitude and duration of the biotic enterprise. It is exactly a century, I believe. The Origin of Species is published in 1847, so this is 1947. For one species to mourn the death of another is a new thing under the sun. The Cro-Magnon who slew the last mammoth thought only of steaks. The sportsman who shot the last pigeon thought only of his prowess. The sailor who clubbed the last auk thought of nothing at all. Can I interpose? The shepherd on Falkland Islands who stabbed the last Falkland Islands wolf thought nothing at all. But we, and then went and drank a beer. But we who have lost our pigeons mourn the loss. Had the funeral been ours, the pigeons would hardly have mourned us. Right? Interspecies altruism is a very rare phenomenon in nature. Right? Humans. Had the funeral been ours, the pigeons would hardly have mourned us. They probably would have cheered, right? Sung that song, right? Na, 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 na. Right? Hey, hey, goodbye, humans. We're free again. Anyway, in this fact, rather than in Mr. Vandevar Bush's bombs, I guess some big, warlord who made good bombs, or Mr. DuPont's nylons, lies objective evidence of our superiority over the beasts. Right? Interspecies, the existence in the human heart of interspecies altruism is objective evidence of our superiority over non-humans. And probably we could say the superiority of other types of animals like primates and cetaceans that exhibit some sign